They tore down my greenhouse while I was gone for 48 hours, and by the time I got back, 15 years of my life was scattered across the dirt like broken ice glass glittering in the late sun, like it was proud of what it had done. And the worst part wasn't the wreckage, it wasn't even the money. It was the note they left behind, bright orange and stapled up like they thought they'd done me a favor. I live just outside a little place called Marston Ridge, about an hour north of Austin. The kind of town where people wave even if they don't know your name, and the traffic jam is usually a tractor turning left. My family's had this land since my granddad came home from Vietnam and decided he was done taking orders from anybody. 128 acres of Texas soil, mostly flat, with a gentle roll to it, good sun, stubborn clay underneath if you dig too deep. It's not glamorous land, no pretty postcard hills, no fancy stone gates, but it's honest land, and it's been enough. I raise vegetables, rotate a little hay lease out part of the back pasture for cattle some seasons. Nothing flashy, just work that starts before the sky's awake and ends when your hands are too tired to hold a fork without thinking about it. About 16 years ago, my wife Claire and I built the greenhouse. We didn't hire contractors. We didn't call in some crew with matching shirts and a Bluetooth speaker blasting classic rock. We poured the footings ourselves, set the frame in July heat that made the air ripple. Argued about measurements, laughed about it later, because when you build something together, you build a memory into every bolt, whether you mean to or not. It started small, just a way to stretch the growing season, but over time it became the heart of the farm. Heirloom tomatoes when it shouldn't have been possible, herbs year-round, specialty greens for a couple restaurants in town, and enough surplus that we donated boxes to the church pantry every month. That greenhouse was more than glass and steel. It was early mornings with coffee in hand, condensation sliding down the panels while Claire hummed those old country songs she swore she didn't even like. It was the place I went after she passed 3 years ago, just to stand there breathing in damp soil and basil and feel like something steady still existed. So picture me pulling up the gravel drive on a Sunday evening truck, dusty from a fishing trip with my brother, already thinking about what I needed to harvest Monday morning, and I round the bend past the pecan trees, and something feels off. Too much sky. That's the first thing my brain notices, like it's trying to protect me from what my eyes haven't accepted yet. I actually slowed down because my mind couldn't make sense of it. Where the greenhouse should have been, there was nothing but twisted ribs of metal and glittering shards spread across dark soil. The automatic vents lay crushed like soda cans. Irrigation lines were ripped right out of the ground, yanked and torn like somebody got mad at the earth itself. For a second, I honestly thought maybe a tornado had skipped through just that one spot. We get strange weather out here. Texas likes to remind you it can be gentle in the morning and violent by dinner. But then I saw the tracks. Skid steer tracks, clean and deliberate tread marks. Human destruction, not wind. I parked, got out, and I just stood there. No yelling, no dramatic drop to my knees, just this tight pressure in my chest like someone cinched a strap around my ribs and kept pulling. My boots crunched on glass when I finally moved, and the sound was so wrong out there, sharp and bright like it didn't belong on my land. That's when I saw the paper, bright orange, stapled to one bent beam like a prize ribbon at the world's cruelest fair. Notice of removal. Non-compliant agricultural structure. Violation of community environmental standards. And at the bottom, in confident blue ink, like it was signing a birthday card, was the name of the homeowners association from the new development bordering my south fence line. Silverbrook Estates. Signed beneath it, Victor Langford, board president. Silverbrook had been built about 5 years back. Big stucco houses, fake stone accents, artificial ponds, a little clubhouse with columns trying real hard to look like some southern historic estate. They marketed it as luxury country living, which I always found funny considering they built it right up against an actual working farm. But people move where they move. At first we got along fine enough. A few residents would come by to buy produce. Kids would press against the fence and watch the tractors like I was running a free petting zoo for machinery. But over time, the board started sending letters. Complaints about early morning equipment noise. Complaints about the smell when we turned compost. Complaints about dust during harvest. I responded politely every time because that's who I am, and because I'd rather sleep at night than win an argument at noon. Farming isn't quiet. Soil has a smell. Wind carries dust. And my family had been there decades before their gated entrance ever existed. Usually the letters stopped after a lawyer from town reminded them gently but firmly about county right to farm laws. But this was different. I read that orange notice 3 times, then walked the perimeter of the wreckage like maybe my legs would find a reason it wasn't real. The greenhouse had sat entirely on my property a good 300 yards from the shared boundary. No dispute about that. I had survey maps in a file cabinet in my office, neat dated, stamped the kind of paperwork that doesn't care how confident your blue ink looks. My neighbor Eli from the north side must have heard my truck or felt something in the air because he drove his ATV over. He took one look and let out this low whistle like he'd just seen a deer walk upright. "Who did this?" he asked. I handed him the notice. He shook his head, slow jaw, working like he was chewing on words he didn't want to swallow. "You gonna call the sheriff?" "Oh yeah," I said. "I am absolutely calling the sheriff." The deputy came out within the hour, took photos, measured distances, crouched down to look at the tracks, stood up and stared across the empty space where my greenhouse had been. He didn't say much, but I could tell from the way his jaw tightened that this wasn't going to be treated like a minor neighbor dispute. Private property destruction is still private property destruction, even if you live behind decorative gates and pretend the world ends at your landscaping. That night, after everyone left and the sun dropped behind the live oaks, I sat on the tailgate of my truck staring at what used to be the center of my world. I should have been furious right away, right? Like fire in the blood, punch a wall, furious. Instead, at first I felt hollow, like the part of me that knew how to be steady had been scooped out with a shovel. Then the anger came in waves, and it wasn't just because they tore it down. It was because they assumed they could. They assumed a farmer wouldn't fight back, that I'd grumble, maybe threaten, then eventually accept some half-hearted settlement. They assumed their property values mattered more than my livelihood. They assumed their little board meetings meant something out here on land that's been worked with real hands for real generations. What they didn't understand was this: that greenhouse wasn't just sitting there by coincidence. It had been built directly over the primary irrigation control hub for the lower half of my land. Years ago, when Silverbrook was first being developed, their contractors approached me about access to the aquifer line that runs beneath my property. They wanted the easiest route for their decorative water features, their fountains, their ponds, their brochure-perfect lawns. The cleanest path tied into the main pump station I already maintained. We negotiated an agreement. They paid a one-time infrastructure fee and signed a usage contract that gave them water flow through my system, but ownership and operational control stayed mine. The pump house, the filters, the pressure regulators, all of it sat on my land under a locked steel door, and I was the one with the keys. For 5 years, I never had a reason to think about it. Water flowed. Their fountains sparkled. Their ponds stayed full. Their little golf green looked like something out of a magazine that's never met the Texas sun. Sitting there in the dark looking at the wreckage of my greenhouse, I realized something painfully simple. The irrigation lines they ripped out when they bulldozed that structure weren't decorative. They were connected to everything. I stood up, brushed dirt off my jeans, and walked toward the pump house. Now, I want you to hear me when I say this. I'm not a reckless man. I don't act without thinking it through. My granddad used to say, never pull a lever you're not prepared to live with after it's pulled. And he didn't say it like a quote you stitch on a pillow. He said it like a warning. The pump house sits about 50 yards behind where the greenhouse used to be. It's a squat concrete building with a tin roof and a heavy steel door that still has my granddad's old padlock hanging from it. Most people would drive right past and never think twice. It's not impressive. It doesn't sparkle. But it's the quiet center of everything that grows on my land, and apparently everything that stayed green in Silverbrook. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was cooler in there, humming faintly with the steady rhythm of the primary pump. Pressure gauges lined the wall, little needles sitting comfortably in the green zone like nothing in the world had changed. Through the main manifold ran 2 primary branches, one feeding my irrigation grid, the other feeding the line that extended south under the fence and into their subdivision. For a long moment, I just stood there listening to the hum. I thought about Claire. I thought about the years we spent building that greenhouse, sweaty and sunburned, laughing when we got something wrong and fixing it anyway. I thought about the check stubs from the restaurants waiting on wintergreens. I thought about the orange notice flapping in the breeze over broken steel like a flag planted in my chest. Then I reached for the secondary valve that controlled outbound flow to Silverbrook. I didn't slam it shut. I didn't yank it like a movie villain. I turned it slowly, deliberately, feeling the resistance shift as pressure rerouted back into my own grid. The gauge for their line dipped, hovered like it wanted to argue, then settled at 0. The hum of the pump changed pitch slightly lighter now, like it could breathe again. I locked the pump house, walked back to my truck, and I slept better that night than I expected. Not because the pain was gone. It wasn't. But because for the first time since I pulled up and saw that empty patch of sky, I didn't feel helpless. The first call came the next afternoon. It was a woman I recognized. Denise Harper lived near the artificial pond on their east side. She used to buy basil from us in the summer, always polite, always paid exact cash like she didn't trust the world with her bank card. "Hey, Daniel," she said, and her voice was tight the way people sound when they're trying to keep panic from showing. "Is something wrong with the water? Our fountain isn't running." I kept my tone even. "You might want to talk to your HOA board about that." There was a pause. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, looking out my window at twisted metal catching afternoon light, "the line feeding your subdivision runs through my property. And until we resolve an issue, it's turned off." Another pause, longer this time, like she was doing math she didn't like. "Daniel, they said your structure violated community standards." "It didn't violate county law," I said, "and it sure as hell didn't violate my property line." She exhaled slow. "I'll talk to Victor." By evening, I had 3 more calls. Confusion, mostly then, a little edge creeping in as people started realizing how dependent they were on something they didn't own. I repeated the same line to each of them. "Talk to your board." Day 1 without water. Their fountain sputtered dry, that dramatic little spray turning into a sad dribble. Then silence. The streams that ran between their landscaped rocks became trickles. Then nothing. At sunset, I drove the perimeter fence just to see it with my own eyes, and I watched residents walking around their ponds with hands on hips, staring at mud creeping inward from the edges like something alive was eating their dream. Day 2, the real impact started. Silverbrook had built their identity around lush landscaping. Imported sod young magnolias, decorative reeds along the water, the kind of green that doesn't happen naturally out here unless you fight for it every day. Without constant irrigation, the Texas sun doesn't take long to remind you who's in charge. By mid-afternoon, I could see the grass dulling from deep green to tired olive like it was losing the will to perform. That evening, Victor Langford showed up at my gate. He didn't come alone. He drove a black SUV that probably cost more than my tractor, and he brought 2 other board members with him. A man named Colin and a woman named Marissa, who always looked like she was personally offended by the existence of dust. I met them at the gate, leaning against the fence post like I had all the time in the world, because in that moment I kind of did. Victor didn't bother with small talk. "Turn the water back on," he said like he was ordering room service. I tilted my head. "That's not how this works." He glanced past me at the farm, then back. "You're intentionally damaging property values in Silverbrook. We have reports of ponds dropping by the hour. Landscaping is dying." "You intentionally destroyed my greenhouse," I said. "We have reports of that too," Colin cut in, trying to sound reasonable from the sheriff. "But you can't just cut off essential utilities." I straightened slow. "Essential utilities you access through my infrastructure under a usage agreement, one that requires mutual respect and compliance with state property law." Victor's jaw tightened. "That structure violated our environmental standards. It was an eyesore. The glare alone was—" "It was 300 yards from your fence, Victor," I said, and my voice stayed calm, which honestly made him angrier. "On my land, built 15 years ago." Marissa stepped forward. The reflection posed a hazard to drivers along the southern bend of our internal road. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was ridiculous. "Your internal road that sits entirely on your property," I said. "You're welcome to plant taller trees." Colin tried another angle. "Look, Daniel, this doesn't need to escalate. We can discuss compensation, but nothing." I interrupted. "You sent heavy equipment onto my land without permission and leveled a working structure. That's not a disagreement. That's trespass and destruction." For a moment, nobody spoke. The wind picked up and tugged at the weeds along the fence dust, crawling across the gravel like it wanted to listen. Finally, Victor said, "What do you want?" I met his eyes. "Accountability." He scoffed. "Be serious." "I am serious," I said. "You rebuild my greenhouse at your expense. You compensate me for lost crops and contract disruptions. And we renegotiate the water agreement." Marissa crossed her arms. "You're extorting us." "No," I said, calm as stone. "I'm responding proportionally." They left without another word, and I watched that black SUV back down the drive like a shiny beetle that realized it had wandered onto the wrong porch. By day 3, the weather shifted. A dry front moved in from the west, gusty winds that make the trees sound like they're whispering warnings. Normally, their irrigated lawns would anchor the topsoil along their graded lots. Without moisture, the ground started to loosen, and the land did what land does when it dries out. It lifted. That afternoon, I drove into town for feed and passed the main entrance to Silverbrook, and even from the highway, I could see a haze hanging over the rooftops, like the whole place had been dusted with flour. Later, Eli called me laughing so hard he had to breathe between words. "You seen this?" he asked. "Seen what?" "Check the local community page," he said. "Somebody posted a video." I pulled it up, and there it was. One of Silverbrook's pristine cul-de-sacs dust devils spinning across driveways coating white SUVs in a fine layer of tan powder. Kids ran inside covering their faces, moms waving arms like they could swat the wind away. The kind of scene that would have been tragic if it weren't also, honestly, a little bit perfect. By evening, my phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a resident. It was a reporter from the Marston County Ledger. "Mr. Reyes," she said, "we received aerial photographs of Silverbrook showing significant environmental degradation. We understand there's a dispute involving irrigation access. Would you care to comment?" I'll tell you the truth. I'd sent those photos that morning. A buddy of mine flies drones for real estate listings, and I asked him real casual if he could get me a few shots over the fence line. Not to gloat, not even to shame, but because I've learned something in my life. People can argue with your words. They can't argue with a picture of what their choices look like. I kept my statement measured. There was an unlawful destruction of property on my farm. Until that matter is resolved, I'm exercising my legal rights regarding infrastructure located on my land. The story ran online before midnight, and the comments were exactly what you'd expect. People who've never grown a tomato in their life suddenly became experts on farming etiquette. People who've never dealt with an HOA suddenly had strong opinions about community standards. It was a circus, but it was a useful one. Day 4 was chaos. Insurance adjusters started showing up at Silverbrook's gate. Landscapers scrambled to truck an emergency water, but you can't just spray a few lawns and expect an entire engineered ecosystem to recover. Their ponds dropped low enough to expose ugly plastic liners beneath the decorative rocks. Their brochure-famous little golf green turned patchy and brown. Wind carried loose soil across their manicured sidewalks and into their open garages like the land was repossessing itself. By late afternoon, I got a certified letter from their attorneys threatening injunctions and damages, the whole scary font routine. I forwarded it straight to my lawyer. Carla Gwynn, a no-nonsense woman who had represented my family before and never once smiled unless somebody was about to regret something. She called me within the hour. "Daniel," she said, "I reviewed the original water agreement. They're in breach due to documented trespass and destruction. You're within your rights to suspend service pending resolution." I stared at the empty skeleton of my greenhouse through the window. "I'm not the one who started this." "I know," she said. "Just make sure you're ready to finish it. They will escalate." And she was right, because Victor Langford was not a man used to losing control. Guys like him don't just want to win. They want you to feel small while they do it. And when that doesn't happen, they get desperate. By the end of that first week, Silverbrook didn't look like the glossy brochure they mailed out every spring. It looked tired. Ponds receded far enough that the edges cracked in spiderweb patterns. The decorative reeds drooped like overcooked spaghetti. Their grand entrance fountain, the one with fake limestone tiers, stood silent, streaked with mineral stains that had never been meant to show. And the wind just kept coming, because out here, when land dries out, it doesn't politely stay put. It travels. It reminds you everything green is temporary without stewardship. Victor called again on day 6. His voice was different this time. Less command, more strain. "We need to meet," he said. I agreed to meet at the fence line the next morning. When I got there, he was already waiting. No SUV this time, just his truck. He looked like he hadn't slept much. His once crisp polo was wrinkled dust clinging to the cuffs like it had claimed him. Behind him, through the open gate of their subdivision, I could see landscaping crews spraying water from tanker trucks in a losing battle against physics. He didn't start with threats. "The board is under pressure," he said. "Residents are furious. Some are talking about legal action against us." I leaned against the fence post. Actions tend to have consequences. He exhaled. "We shouldn't have sent the crew without final mediation." That was as close to an apology as I was going to get, and we both knew it. "Shouldn't have," I repeated. "But we did," he said, nodding once. "Yes, we did." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wind carried a swirl of dust between us, settling on the fence rails like fine powder, like the world itself was quietly taking notes. "What are your terms?" he asked, and this time his voice was low, almost careful. I laid them out again, slow and clear. "Because if you ever want someone to understand you, you don't rush the truth." "You rebuild my greenhouse," I said. "Not the same size. Double the square footage. Steel frame rated for higher wind loads. Tempered glass. Automated venting upgraded. You cover every dollar. You compensate me for lost crops, projected revenue from my restaurant contracts, replacement of damaged irrigation lines. He listened and I kept going. You sign a revised water agreement, I said. Annual compensation indexed to usage. Explicit acknowledgement that infrastructure on my land is not subject to your board's aesthetic opinions. He swallowed like that part tasted bad. And I added the board issues a written statement admitting fault for unlawful trespass and destruction. Publicly. That last one hit him. You could see it. The way his eyes tightened, the way his pride stood up like a scared animal. You want us to humiliate ourselves, he said. I shrugged. You humiliated me first. Difference is I'm not hiding behind a gated entrance. He rubbed his face with both hands slow like he was trying to wipe the week off his skin. This will cost us a fortune. I looked past him at the brown sweep of what used to be emerald lawn. So did bulldozing 15 years of my life. He asked for 48 hours. I didn't turn the water back on. Those 2 days were the worst for Silverbrook because now the story had legs. Word spread beyond town. A regional news station picked it up, running drone footage of shrinking ponds alongside interviews about property rights and right-to-farm laws. Comment sections lit up with people taking sides. Some called me vindictive, others called me a hero. I didn't feel like either. I felt tired. On the second evening, Eli came over with a six-pack and we sat on the tailgate again, just like the night I found the wreckage. The sky was that dusty pink Texas gets when the air is dry and the sun is trying to be gentle about how hard it's leaving. You ever think about just selling and moving somewhere quieter? He asked. I stared at the outline where the greenhouse used to cast shade at dusk. Maybe, I said, but then I'd just be leaving the lesson half taught. He chuckled. You always did have a stubborn streak. I call it boundaries, I said, and I meant it. Because there's a difference between revenge and a boundary. Revenge is about hurting somebody. A boundary is about refusing to be hurt again. The next morning, Victor returned. This time he carried a folder. We accept your terms, he said, and his voice sounded like sandpaper. All of them. He handed me a draft agreement prepared by their attorneys. Carla had already reviewed a copy that morning and marked her revisions in red, and let me tell you, seeing Carla's red ink on their polished legal language was like watching a hawk tear into a snake. Efficient, brutal, beautiful. They'd conceded faster than I expected, and I had a feeling it wasn't because Victor suddenly found humility in his heart. It was because their insurance carriers were breathing down their necks, and homeowners were threatening recall elections. When you mess with people's lawns in a place like Silverbrook, you mess with their religion. The public statement went out that afternoon. Carefully worded, of course, like they were trying to admit guilt without admitting they had a spine, but it still said what mattered, that the board had acted without proper legal authority in authorizing removal of a structure located entirely on adjacent private property. I read it twice and I felt something unclench in my chest that I didn't realize had been tight. Construction began within the week. Now here's where people love to judge me, and maybe you will too. I didn't turn the water back on immediately. For 2 more weeks, Silverbrook hauled in water by truck. Their residents endured dusty sidewalks and half-dead lawns. The board held tense meetings in their clubhouse while homeowners demanded resignations. 2 board members stepped down before the new greenhouse foundation was even poured. Some folks say that was me being petty. Maybe it was. But I'll tell you what it also was. It was me making sure the rebuild wasn't just a promise they'd try to wiggle out of once the pressure eased. Because people like Victor, they're good at saying what you want to hear when they're cornered, then rewriting the story later when they're comfortable again. I needed to see steel delivered. I needed to see concrete poured. I needed to see it rising from the ground like something real. When the steel frame finally went up taller and broader than the original, I walked the perimeter slow. It felt strange seeing something familiar reborn, larger, stronger, like the land itself had decided it wasn't done with me. I thought about Claire and I could almost hear her voice in my head, that soft stubbornness she had. If you're gonna fix something, she used to say, fix it better than it was before. On the day the last pane of tempered glass was installed, Victor met me at the pump house. He didn't say much, he just nodded toward the door like he couldn't bring himself to ask. I unlocked it, stepped inside, and for the first time in weeks I placed my hand on the valve feeding Silverbrook. The metal was cool under my palm. The pump's hum was steady, patient, like it had been waiting for the grown-ups to finish talking. You understand, I said without looking at him, this isn't about punishment anymore. It's about respect. He swallowed. Understood. I turned the valve slowly. The gauge needle climbed steady and sure. The pump's hum deepened, pressure equalizing through the line, and within minutes, somewhere beyond the fence, a fountain sputtered, then roared back to life. We walked outside, and in the distance, faint cheers drifted from their entrance like the neighborhood had won a war they started. Victor extended his hand. I shook it. Not because we were friends, not because I trusted him, but because I wanted him to feel in that simple grip that this land wasn't something you could manage with a committee and a clipboard. It was real, and it had teeth. From that day forward, a check arrived every month like clockwork. Annual compensation for water access exactly as the new agreement specified. No more letters about dust, no more complaints about smell. When their residents wanted fresh produce, they came to the farm stand and paid like everyone else. And the new greenhouse, it thrived. Double the space meant I expanded into specialty peppers and winter citrus experiments that made the restaurant owners smile like kids. I hired 2 local teenagers part-time, taught them about soil health and patience, and why you don't rush nature unless you want her to humble you. Standing inside that larger structure on cool mornings, sunlight diffused through the glass, I sometimes caught myself expecting to hear Claire humming again, and when I didn't, it still hurt. But it hurt in a quieter way, like a scar instead of an open wound. People still bring up the story when they see me in town. Some say I went too far, that I could have resolved it in court without letting an entire neighborhood dry out. Others say I taught a necessary lesson about power and entitlement. The truth sits somewhere in between. Did I enjoy watching their fountains run dry? Not exactly. But I'll admit there was a certain clarity in seeing cause and effect play out so plainly. You can't bulldoze someone's livelihood and expect the earth to keep cooperating with you like nothing happened. You can't treat a working farm like a messy backdrop for your luxury country living fantasy and then act shocked when the real country pushes back. Silverbrook still stands. Lawns are green again. Property values recovered. Life moved on because it always does. But every now and then when the wind kicks up and carries a thin veil of dust across the southern fence line, I notice residents glance toward my fields with a little more awareness than before, like they finally understand that the world doesn't revolve around their gates. They know now that beneath their manicured streets runs a line that begins on land they do not control. And I know something too, something I wish I'd learned younger before grief and work and politeness wore grooves into me. Sometimes the only way to be heard isn't by shouting. Sometimes it's by turning a valve and letting silence do the talking. So here's what I want to ask you honestly. Was I wrong to hold the line as long as I did? Should I have turned the water back on the moment they agreed to rebuild? Or was it necessary for them to feel the full weight of what they did before anything could truly reset? Tell me what you think. Where's the line between standing your ground and going too far? And if you've ever dealt with an overreaching HOA, a land dispute, or that moment where you had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting what's yours, I want to hear that too. Because communities only work when respect runs both directions, and sometimes the most satisfying kind of justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's quiet, steady, and earned one slow turn at a time.